Hi all, in this video we're going to talk about arrays in C#. So let's start now. What's an array? By definition, it's simply a series of consecutive memory cells that store the same type of data. Each of these array cells is termed an element, and each can contain a value different from another element. However, even though they can all have a different piece of data, they must all have the same data type, meaning you can't have an array where one element stores a string and the other stores a number. Each element has an index number, which is basically a number that we can use to identify individual elements. Now, as the figure shows, index numbers start from 0. And the index of the last element is always one less the size of the array. In this case, we have an array of 5 elements. The last element would have index number 4. Now let's see how we can create an array in C#. There are two types of arrays that we can create: arrays of value types and arrays of reference types. So let's first talk about the former. We're going to create an array of 5 decimals. We start out by specifying the data type and a set of square brackets indicating we're going to make an array. Then we have the name of the array, expenses. We're going to talk more about this later, but expenses is actually a reference variable. On the right hand side, we allocate the actual array of 5 decimal elements using the new keyword, then the data type, a set of square brackets, and then the size of our array. Now, arrays are reference types objects. So the name of the array is actually the name of a reference variable, which refers to the actual array, which is an object in memory. So let's look at what we have now. We have our reference variable expenses, which refers to an array object of 5 decimals somewhere else in memory. And again, the general rule of thumb, the name of the array is the name of the reference variable, which points to the actual array. To access the first element, we specify the name of the array, expenses, the set of square brackets, and then the index number. And as you can see, our last element has an index number 1 less the size of the array, in this case 4. Each element, when we created the array, was automatically set to 0. When we have an array, we get sequentially stored variables that are grouped under a name. So let's see how we can refer to individual elements. Here we've shown the creation of a 5-element array, expenses. And then we've added a couple of more statements which assign individual values to expenses element 0, expenses element 2, and finally the last element of expenses, which has index number 4. Notice how we specify the array name, a set of square brackets, and the index number within the brackets to refer to a specific element. Keep in mind that each element is still a decimal object, and each object, if you think of it this way, has a name, which consists of the array name, the square brackets, and the index number. Now, here's an example of using a for loop with an array. We declare the counter variable, and we call it idx, short for index. The condition of the for loop specifies that the for loop will run as long as the value of index is less than the length of the array. Now, since arrays are actually objects, they also have methods and properties. One of these properties is length, which returns the number of elements in the array. And here we also show how we can use the value of a variable for the index number instead of hard coding the value in like 0, 1, or 2. We initialized the loop counter to 0, and we made it run only as long as the value of index was less than the number of elements in the array. If we didn't do it this way, eventually the value of the counter variable would have maybe reached 5 or 6, which doesn't exist within our array. Our array only has elements 0 to 4. If we tried to access an element that's outside of the array, our program would crash. And this is called an out-of-bounds error. Now, arrays of reference types are a little bit tricky. Assume we have defined the class circle. Let's start by declaring and defining a new array of 5 circles. And as you can see, it's no different from creating an array of decimals. Now, does this mean we have an array of 5 circle objects? The answer actually is no. Now let's see what we have here. We have myCircles, which refers to the 5-element array. However, each element is not a circle object. Each element is a circle reference. So this means that each element can refer to its own circle object. When we created myCircles, all of its elements were automatically set to the value null, meaning they don't reference any circle object. If we try to access the element under the impression that it's a circle object, and let's say we try to access property radius, our program would crash because there is no circle object. To successfully use the array, we have to initialize each element with a circle object. One way here is to directly set an element to point to a circle object. Another way is to use a for loop that goes through the entire array and allocates a new circle object for each reference. Remember also that each element is merely a circle reference, not a circle object. After initializing the elements, we can now use the element as if we were using a normal circle object. And this is a quick look at our properly initialized array. myCircles references the 5-element array, and in turn, each element of the array references its own circle object. And that's it for this video. If you want to ask me any questions or comments, or if you want to request some tutoring, you can always email me at sparkprogrammer@gmail.com, or my secondary email address, which is concord.spark.tutor@gmail.com.